For decades, the official story seemed complete. You know, you picture the Hollywood machine and it's this unstoppable factory of culture.
Right, the absolute center of the entertainment universe.
Exactly. I mean, imagine walking onto the legendary Sony Pictures lot out in LA. For almost a century, this was the epicenter, the place churning out the dreams and the blockbusters that shaped basically the entire Western world.
Mm-hmm.
But according to the source we're looking at today, if you walk onto that lot now, it's not bustling. There are no golf carts zipping around with A-list directors. It is a ghost town.
Wow. Just completely empty.
Completely empty. And according to our subject today, this isn't just like a temporary economic dip. He claims it is the physical ruin of a massive hidden ideological war.
And that visual, that decaying empty studio lot,
Yeah.
it's really the perfect entry point into what we're investigating today. We're doing a deep dive into a raw and highly controversial interview with the 1990s comedy star Rob Schneider.
Yeah.
And our mission here is strict. We need to be clear
Yeah.
right up front. We are not here to endorse his worldview.
Yeah.
Right. Definitely not.
And we are not here to automatically dismiss it either. We are acting as your investigative guides. So we're going to unpack the anatomy of his arguments, map out this timeline he presents, and examine this really stark alternative perspective on the collapse of modern entertainment.
Because when you listen to Schneider describe his current reality, he doesn't sound like, just a retired actor reminiscing about the good old days.
No, not at all.
He sounds like a whistleblower, like someone who just walked out of a highly classified facility to tell the public that the maps they've been looking at are completely wrong. He's describing this systemic cultural schism.
So the central mystery we have to untangle is, did the Hollywood machine leave Rob Schneider behind? Or did he actively walk away from a system that he now views as deeply authoritarian?
That's the question.
Yeah. And what does his transition from this massive frat comedy superstar to a self-described blacklisted outsider, what does that actually reveal about the forces tearing at our culture right now? Well, to investigate that fracture, we really have to start with the verified timeline. What we know for certain is that in the late 90s and early 2000s, Rob Schneider was embedded at the very top of the traditional studio system.
Oh, yeah. He had the hit movies, the massive paychecks, total insider access.
Right. But today, he operates entirely outside of that centralized authority. And he attributes this initially to a technological shift that he says exposed a much deeper rot. So when he looks at those empty lots at Sony or Fox, he sees the death of the gatekeepers.
Which makes sense, because for a century, that centralized authority held a total monopoly.
Total monopoly, yeah.
If you wanted to be seen, if you wanted to distribute a thought to the masses, you had to go through a studio executive.
Yeah.
You needed their cameras, their distribution networks, their permission, basically.
Yeah, but Schneider points out that technology completely severed that dependency. He specifically brings up creators like the comedian Theo Von.
Oh, right, yeah.
Theo Von doesn't need an executive to greenlight his ideas. He has this independent orbit of millions of followers. And Schneider realized, I don't need television anymore.
But this is where the official explanation and his alternative interpretation begin to diverge.
Oh, so?
Well, most industry analysts look at the creator economy and say streaming and the internet simply broke the old business model. It's an economic disruption.
Right.
But Schneider takes it a step further. He argues that when the central authority of Hollywood lost its monopoly on distribution, it simultaneously lost its monopoly on thought.
Ah, I see. So if you don't need an executive's money to make your project, you're no longer forced to adopt that executive's worldview.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on that slightly. Like, is the studio lot empty because there is some sinister ideological purge happening behind closed doors, like he suggests? Or is this just the brutal reality of capitalism? The internet won, the old factory died, and maybe he's projecting an ideological motive onto just a purely technological shift.
And that is the exact tension we need to explore. Schneider firmly believes the system is actively purging dissenters. He sees Hollywood as this closed ecosystem that now demands what he calls diversity of look, but not diversity of thought.
Wow, diversity of look, but not diversity of thought.
Yeah. But to understand how he arrived at this dark conclusion, we have to look at the first major anomaly he identifies. And it's a contradiction he noticed long before the internet took over.
Okay.
It's the deep psychological disconnect between what the general public loves and consumes and what the cultural elite, specifically the critics, actually praise.
Oh, yes. He calls this the tension between the critic and the clown, and he illustrates this with a really fascinating piece of Hollywood history involving James Cameron.
The Titanic story, right?
Yeah, so Schneider recounts being at a party and striking up a conversation with Cameron. This was right around the time Cameron was working on Titanic, and there was this intense, almost vicious pre-release hatred directed at the film.
Even before it came out.
Exactly. Specifically, Kenneth Turan, the lead film critic for the LA Times, was just eviscerating Titanic before audiences even had a chance to see it.
And according to Schneider, Cameron was initially furious and just confused. He felt the attacks were unfair, that the critic was just attacking the massive budget and the audacity of the project rather than the actual art itself.
Right.
But then a vital shift in perspective happens. Cameron tells Schneider that he eventually saw this critic, Kenneth Turan, giving a television interview on PBS.
And Cameron's reaction was essentially an epiphany. He looked at the critic on the screen and realized the animosity had absolutely nothing to do with cinematic art or narrative structure.
Interesting.
It was entirely based on aesthetics and personal resentment. Cameron told Schneider, "I would hate me too if I was that guy."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it shifted the blame entirely. It wasn't about the movie, it was about the ego and the inherent misery of the observer.
And Schneider connects this specific anecdote to a broader, darker psychological profile of the critical class. He mentions a conversation with a director who explicitly warned him, the critics are never going to like you.
Because he was doing comedies.
Right. And when Schneider asked why, the director explained that critics generally identify with a very specific archetype of suffering. They cited the late brilliant actor Philip Seymour Hoffman as the physical embodiment of this archetype.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the depressed, unhappy, struggling, complex figure.
Which is such an illuminating contrast, because what that director was saying is that the cultural elite see themselves in the miserable guy. They elevate suffering as a sign of high intellect.
Right. If you're not suffering, you're not making art.
Exactly. And therefore, they fundamentally resent the guy who is just having fun. They resent the successful, happy-go-lucky man whore character that Schneider played so often because it represents a populist joy they feel excluded from.
According to the source material, this is the genesis of the ideological divide. It's the politics of envy. It's a group of self-appointed intellectuals sneering at the very people who possess the bravery to step into the arena and entertain the masses.
Yeah.
Which brings up the advice Schneider received from the legendary comedian Norm Macdonald.
Oh, I love this quote.
Yeah, when Schneider asked him where all this critical hatred comes from, Norm simply said, "When you enter the arena, the people in the stands will hate you."
Let's look at the mechanics of that for a second. The dynamic of the spectator resenting the gladiator. It's easy to dismiss this as just an actor complaining that the critics didn't like Deuce Bigalow.
Sure.
But Schneider is taking this micro-complaint and scaling it up to explain a macro-cultural shift. He's arguing that this psychological resentment, this disdain for populist success and traditional masculinity, it didn't stay confined to movie reviews. It calcified into an entire worldview.
Precisely. And in his narrative, those very critics, or at least people driven by that exact same psychology of envy and resentment, eventually became the executives running the institutions.
Right.
Which brings us to the deeper story. The mechanics of what Schneider calls the ideological blacklist. He paints a picture of a modern Hollywood executive class that is entirely paralyzed by fear.
He describes a system built purely on compliance. He claims that executives are no longer making decisions based on what makes a great movie or even what will make the most money.
Right, which is wild for Hollywood.
Yeah, he says they're making decisions solely to delay their inevitable firing so they can hang on to their Malibu beach houses for a few more years. It's survival cowardice.
And that cowardice demands an authoritarian shift. Now, this is where we encounter one of the most highly charged historical comparisons in the entire interview. And we must examine this impartially to understand the anatomy of his argument. Schneider claims that the current climate in Hollywood is a direct reversal of the 1950s McCarthy era. But he doesn't just use it as a metaphor. He goes so far as to state that Senator Joe McCarthy was 100% right.
I mean, hold on. I really struggle with this comparison. He is equating modern corporate diversity mandates to a literal government-backed Red Scare.
It's a huge claim.
Those seem like wildly different mechanisms of power. During McCarthyism, you had the state apparatus dragging citizens in front of congressional tribunals. Today, we're talking about HR departments and social media backlash. How exactly does he justify that leap?
It is a massive leap, and it's highly controversial. Supporters of Schneider's view argue that while the mechanism of power has shifted from state tribunals to corporate HR and social consensus, the result is identical. It's the unpersoning of dissenters.
Okay, so it's about the end result, not the method.
Right. Schneider asserts that the communists truly did infiltrate Hollywood in the 50s, and that those exact same Marxist ideological forces have now successfully completed their takeover of the industry.
Oh.
In his view, they are the ones executing the blacklist today. They're actively targeting conservatives, or even principled traditional liberals, who simply refuse to conform to the new ideological mandates.
Okay, so he sees things like modern inclusion writers, where a production has to hit certain demographic quotas to be eligible for awards. He doesn't see that as progress. He sees it as the enforcement mechanism of a total ideological capture.
Yes, and he contrasts this perceived internal moral decay with the external shattering of the Hollywood illusion. He shares a story about playing low-stakes poker with legendary old-timer actors, including Richard Dreyfuss.
Right, who won an Academy Award for The Goodbye Girl.
Exactly. And Schneider asks him if he still enjoys the magic of making movies.
And Dreyfuss just completely shatters the mirage. He tells Schneider that the public thinks it's all glamour and red carpets, but the reality is you're sitting alone in a cheap mobile home, eating cold food out of a styrofoam box, just waiting for a production assistant to knock on your door. It really is. And even worse, Dreyfuss recalled how literally a month after he won the highest honor in his field, a critic was already trying to diminish the achievement. They published a piece saying it was a weak year for actors. The industry and the critical class turns on you the absolute second it has the opportunity.
But here is where the narrative shifts from an industry critique to a universal warning. Because the fallout of this ideological war is not contained to styrofoam boxes on movie sets or empty studio lots.
Nah, it's much closer to home.
Right. If you are listening to this and wondering why this Hollywood infighting matters to you, Schneider makes it very clear. This fracture has invaded living rooms across the country. He speaks from a place of highly publicized personal pain, revealing his own estrangement from his daughter, the singer Elle King.
Yeah, that was a very public severing. I remember he went on Tucker Carlson's show and offered a public apology to her, admitting he wasn't the father she needed at the time. But the reaction to that apology is the real indicator of the cultural temperature here. It wasn't just tabloid gossip. Schneider said he was utterly overwhelmed by a flood of private messages from parents and grandparents all over America.
He describes it as a nationwide endemic. Thousands of messages from shattered families experiencing the exact same phenomenon. College kids returning home for the holidays and completely severing ties with their parents over ideological differences.
Oh.
Grandparents being told they can no longer see their grandchildren because they voted for the wrong candidate or hold the wrong cultural views.
And this is a crucial pivot in his logic, because Schneider doesn't look at this mass familial severing as a bunch of random isolated family disputes.
No.
He views them as intentional casualties.
Yeah.
This introduces what we can call the alternative theory of cultural sabotage. He argues that this isn't organic societal evolution. It is a highly coordinated leftist grievance attack purposefully designed to break down every fundamental pillar of Western civilization, and the family unit is the primary target.
To understand how he believes this attack is coordinated, we have to look at how he traces the machinery of grievance culture.
Yeah.
Interestingly, he explicitly states that he supported the original gay rights movement.
Oh, he did.
Yes, he believed it was just and necessary and 100% right that people should not face discrimination. And he supported marriage equality. But his alternative theory claims that once that movement achieved its civil rights victories, it was essentially hijacked.
He uses the word usurped. He claims the movement was usurped by NGOs, lawyers, and professional activists who needed to keep their funding and relevance alive.
Right.
So to keep the money train going, they had to manufacture a new frontier of grievance, which he identifies as the modern trans movement. Now, that is an incredibly heavy, systemic accusation to levy against a cultural movement. Does he offer a specific mechanism for how these NGOs supposedly engineered this?
He points to the medicalization of youth identity as the mechanism.
Yeah.
And we must navigate this next section carefully, just reporting his claims exactly as they appear in the source material. Schneider takes an intensely oppositional, uncompromising stance on modern gender identity politics and gender-affirming care for minors. He does not view it as healthcare. He categorizes it as a social contagion and an evil indoctrination of children.
And he goes into highly graphic detail regarding his opposition to puberty blockers. He claims they are essentially repurposed castration drugs that cause irreversible physical damage. He specifically cites conditions like micropenis as a consequence for young boys transitioning. He views the entire medical framework surrounding this as a horrific abuse of vulnerable youth.
And his proposed solution to this perceived social contagion is equally controversial. He suggests, and perhaps he's half joking but with serious underlying intent, he suggests that society needs a massive course correction, even arguing that we should bring bullying back.
I really want to dissect the logic there, because how does someone argue that bullying is a social good?
Well, his rationale seems to be that old-school physical bullying, the classic wedgie or getting your head dunked in a toilet, he thinks that actually served an evolutionary purpose. It acted as a necessary, non-toxic corrective for narcissistic or entitled young men. It established boundaries.
Right.
In his view, removing that physical friction from childhood has allowed grand illusions to flourish completely unchecked in adulthood.
Which perfectly transitions into how he views the broader geopolitical landscape. This framework of unchecked delusion isn't just about domestic culture. He applies it globally. He borrows a fascinating concept from the evolutionary behavioral scientist Gad Saad called suicidal empathy.
Let's explore the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
Because empathy is almost universally viewed as a pro-social positive trait. How does empathy become a weapon against the self?
Right. Well, in evolutionary psychology, empathy ensures group survival by making us care for the vulnerable. But suicidal empathy is a malfunction of that system. It is defined as a state where you care more about the person actively harming you than you do about the victim.
Oh, I see.
It is empathy manipulated by an aggressor to paralyze the defender.
And Schneider applies this concept of suicidal empathy directly to the Western reaction surrounding the Israel-Hamas conflict. He calls out Hollywood celebrities. He specifically names Javier Bardem, accusing them of displaying selective, ignorant outrage.
According to the source, Schneider's perspective is that Israel is facing an enemy that intentionally uses hospitals and civilian infrastructure as shields, while Israel goes to unprecedented military lengths to avoid civilian casualties. Yet the global outrage is directed almost entirely at Israel.
Right.
He argues that a soulless evil group has successfully hacked Western empathy, manipulating global opinion to shield themselves from consequence.
He points out the sheer terror of seeing a massive rise in open anti-Semitism in Western cities, people spewing hatred in public squares in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago.
Yeah, it's really shocking.
And he asks a piercing question. Where is the celebrity outrage for the Christians currently being massacred in Nigeria? To him, the selective nature of the empathy proves that it isn't true compassion. It's performative compliance to a narrative.
If we synthesize all of this, we see the complete architecture of his worldview. Schneider is not just listing a series of isolated conservative talking points about movies, gender, and the Middle East. He is describing a unified, multi-front war.
Right, it's all connected for him.
Exactly. In his mind, the empty studio lots in Hollywood, the bitter film critics, the severed ties with his daughter, the rise of gender surgeries, and the geopolitical protests on college campuses are all symptoms of one single coordinated effort. An effort to replace a high-trust, family-oriented Western civilization with a low-trust, totalitarian society.
But here's where we hit a massive, glaring contradiction in the source material.
Oh, yeah.
Within this dark, monolithic view of a totalitarian culture, Schneider introduces a conversation he had with another comedy legend, Jerry Seinfeld.
Right.
They are backstage at the Saturday Night Live 50th anniversary, and Schneider's telling Seinfeld that cancel culture is a real, dangerous blacklist.
Yeah.
And Seinfeld flat out tells him, no, it isn't. Cancel culture does not exist.
It's a fascinating clash of perspectives between two masters of the craft. Seinfeld's argument, as relayed by Schneider, is purely technical. Seinfeld believes that audiences aren't actually canceling comedians out of malice. It's just that comedians aren't being clever enough to bypass the audience's newly evolved defenses.
That's like a hacker bypassing a firewall.
Exactly. Seinfeld points to Sarah Silverman as the ultimate master of this technique. He explains that Silverman will get on stage and explicitly state, "I would never, ever tell a racist joke."
She acknowledges the boundary.
Right. She acknowledges the societal boundary. And then, having disarmed the tension, she proceeds to tell a wildly offensive joke. By stating the boundary first, she tricks the audience's psychology into giving her permission to cross it. To Seinfeld, cultural sensitivity isn't an ideological wall, it's just a higher degree of difficulty for the joke writer.
But Schneider entirely rejects that premise.
Mm.
He respects Seinfeld immensely, and he thinks Silverman is a genius, but he fundamentally disagrees that it's merely a matter of technique. To use your analogy, if Seinfeld sees himself as a hacker slipping past the firewall, Schneider views the comedian as a battering ram that must smash the wall to pieces. He believes the ideological threat is real, and to prove it, he shares a wild example from his own life.
We really have to pause and look at the absolute absurdity of this specific setting. He talks about doing a stand-up benefit for a pediatric ward in Saskatchewan, Canada.
You literally couldn't write a more wholesome, delicate setup for a
It
disaster.
sounds like a premise for a sketch.
It really does.
The organizers tell him before he goes on, just do the material you feel is most appropriate. And Schneider's immediate visceral reaction is defiance. You're not going to tell me what to say.
Oh, no.
So he takes the stage at this hospital benefit and intentionally starts doing his most heavily controversial material regarding trans and gay issues.
And the reaction he describes in the room is highly revealing of his underlying theory. He says he could physically see the audience holding back their laughter. They were terrified.
Let's explore the mechanics of that moment. Laughter is an involuntary physical reflex.
Right. You can't help it.
So what is the psychological friction happening in that room that causes a human being to choke down an involuntary response? It's pure social terror. It's the fear of being the one person caught on camera or seen by your boss laughing at what the consensus has labeled hate speech. Schneider ended up getting pulled from the stage by the organizers. But he didn't feel embarrassed or remorseful. He felt justified. He said, if you're attacking the people that are attacking the culture, I think that's required as a comedian.
That specific phrasing, required as a comedian, it elevates the role of the comic from a mere entertainer to a frontline soldier in this cultural war.
Yeah.
And he backs this up with a profound historical insight he learned from Ilya Baskin, a Russian actor who lived under the oppression of the Soviet Union. Baskin told Schneider that the Iron Curtain truly began to collapse, not from military pressure or economic sanctions, but the exact moment the citizens started laughing at the government, the moment they openly ridiculed the intolerance.
That is such a powerful mechanism. Totalitarian systems, which Schneider explicitly equates modern woke culture to, they rely on the illusion of absolute permanence and seriousness.
Right, they have to be taken seriously.
They demand compliance through fear, so they seem incredibly intimidating. But the moment they are subjected to mass public ridicule, that foundation of fear turns to sand, and the entire structure collapses rapidly. In this worldview, the comedian isn't just telling jokes. The comedian is the little boy pointing out that the emperor has no clothes. The laughter isn't just entertainment. It is a vital geopolitical weapon against tyranny.
Which brings us to the final necessary resolution of this narrative. Because if you truly believe you are fighting a total war against an ideological system that has cost you your industry standing, tanked your reputation, and strained your most intimate family ties, well, how do you survive the daily reality of that fallout without becoming totally consumed by paranoia and bitterness?
It's a huge question. And for Schneider, the answer was completely stepping outside the paradigm of Hollywood's moral framework. He looks at how Hollywood defines morality and sees it as a parasitic form of narcissism.
Interesting.
He tracks the evolution of celebrity virtue signaling. Like 20 years ago, it was carrying teacup puppies in your purse to show how caring you were. Then, the trend shifted to adopting babies from developing nations. And today, he claims, the ultimate status symbol for a Hollywood celebrity trying to prove their moral superiority is having a trans child.
Wow.
He views it all as a desperate, parasitical attempt by aging, insecure stars to maintain their fame and relevance.
To insulate himself from that endless cycle of status games, Schneider turned to traditional faith, specifically converting to Catholicism. And he shares a theological concept he learned from a priest, Father Mike Passo, that deeply reoriented his perspective.
What was it?
The priest explained to him that the suffering of the baby Jesus, just the cold air touching the newborn's skin on the night of his birth in the manger, was in itself enough of a sacrifice to pay for all of humanity's salvation.
That one specific image, the cold air on a newborn's skin being enough to save the world, that acted as a spiritual armor for him. Because if the creator of the universe offers that level of infinite, overwhelming grace, then holding on to petty, earthly grudges or seeking revenge against a Hollywood executive who blacklisted you, it becomes completely absurd.
He reinforces this with a quote from biblical scholar Frank Turek, who told him, "Bitterness is a pill that we give ourselves."
That's powerful.
It is. In a culture that Schneider views as increasingly hateful, vindictive, and focused on destruction and cancellation, he realizes that fighting fire with fire only burns you from the inside out.
Right.
The ultimate act of rebellion, the true countercultural move in 2024, is not to destroy your enemies, but but to forgive them. And more importantly, to leave the door open for the family members who have walked away, trusting that the fever will eventually break.
So, after mapping out this incredibly dark, complex, alternative reality, what are we left with? We started by talking about a factory, the Hollywood machine, that used to print all the cultural maps we use to navigate society. Schneider is arguing that those maps are now intentionally leading us off a cliff, and he is trying to build his own compass from scratch.
And regardless of whether you agree with his specific directions, we are undeniably witnessing a moment where the very mechanism of consensus is broken. How we agree on what is funny, what is true, and what is moral has been entirely shattered.
It really has. And it leaves me thinking about that audience sitting in the dark in Saskatchewan, physically choking down their own laughter out of fear. If laughter truly is an involuntary reflex, and as Schneider argues, it is the ultimate metric for a culture's actual freedom, well, what does it say about the state of our society when half the population is laughing at a joke and the other half is frantically pulling the fire alarm to make sure the comedian never holds a microphone again? Are we just watching the ugly, drawn-out death of comedy? Or are we witnessing the messy, chaotic birth of a completely new, decentralized reality where the emperor isn't just naked, but he's finally been locked out of the theater entirely? That's something to think about. Keep questioning the narrative. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.